In this session, we're going to be reading the account of Elijah's visit to the village of Zarephath, as recorded in 1 Kings 17, verses 8 to 16. As always, we're primarily going to focus on building our reading skills through a detailed engagement with the text. So, grab your copy of the Tanakh, and we'll get started. Elijah lived at a crucial moment in the history of the northern kingdom of Israel. Omri had been a mercenary in the service of the king of Samaria, who seized the throne somewhere around 885 BC in the chaos that followed the assassination of King Elah. Although the Bible doesn't give us a lot of information about Omri, we know from extra-biblical sources that he was clearly one of the most important and politically successful kings of the north. He built a new capital city in Samaria, moving the capital from Tirzah there, and stabilized the political, military, and economic situation in the north. In a rare example of dynastic succession, Omri was followed as king by his son Ahab. During their time, Israel faced a growing threat from the northeast, from the Aramean kingdom centered on Damascus. To strengthen his position against Damascus, Omri and Ahab secured an alliance with Judah in the south and with the northern Canaanite peoples. We usually call them by the later Latin name Phoenicians. The Phoenician alliance was sealed by Ahab's marriage to Isabel, usually called Jezebel in English, who was the daughter of the king of Sidon. But from the perspective of the biblical writers, the really important thing about Omri, and especially Ahab, is that he not only tolerated, but aggressively promoted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal alongside, and ultimately in place of, Yahweh. Elijah appears on the scene suddenly at the beginning of 1 Kings 17 to oppose Ahab and Jezebel. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly when this occurred in the reign of Ahab, but probably it was after he had been on the throne for a few years. So a reasonable date for these events would be somewhere around the 860s BC. After declaring a famine at Yahweh's command, Elijah is forced to flee across the Jordan River to hide out. And it's at that point that our account begins. The narrative is initiated by the standard formula for a prophetic revelation. Wahidavar Yahweh Elau Lemor. The word of Yahweh came, or was, to him, saying. Verse 9 begins the actual instruction from God to Yahweh. Kum, lake Zarephath, asher litzion, wa yeshavta sham. The instruction begins with a pair of common call imperatives. Arise, or perhaps more colloquially, get up, and go. The next word, Zarephath, gives us the name of the place to which Elijah is to go, Zarephath, here with a hey directive on the end. The next phrase, Asher Litzidon, tells us something important about Zarephath. It was to Sidon, meaning that it belonged to the territory of Sidon. Now we know a little bit about Zarephath from archaeology. It was a small, moderately prosperous port city about 8 miles south of Sidon. It was a center of pottery production and an export center for a variety of local products, including the famous purple dye, which gave the Phoenicians their name and much of their fame. For the purposes of our narrative, the important thing was this town's connection to Sidon. Sidon, you recall, was the hometown of Jezebel. God was sending Elijah into the lion's den, so to speak, sending him right into the heart of the people who worship Baal. And the events that follow serve as a symbolic slap in the face, both to the Canaanite God and to his supporters back in Israel. Finally, God tells Elijah, Washavta Sham, and settle down there. Here, the wow consecutive perfect follows the previous imperatives and has the force of another instruction. By using the verb yashav, God wants Elijah to understand that this is not going to be a quick visit. He'll be staying in Zarephath for some time. God completes his instruction by telling Elijah what he will find when he gets there. Hine tzawithi sham isha amana lakal kalek. Look here. The particle hine is used to focus the attention of the hearer, Elijah in this case, on an important fact or circumstance. The common gloss behold would be okay, but something like look here gets the idea across to the modern reader a little better. Tzawithi, the verb, is a PL perfect first common singular from the root sade wow he, sawa. The common gloss for this verb is command. That might be overdoing it just a bit here in this context. There's nothing in the text to point to a command given by God to the widow. In a few places, this verb seems to have the sense of something like to determine that something will happen, or more simply, perhaps, to make something happen or arrange for something to happen. And that sense seems to fit the context pretty well here. What God is going to arrange is for a widow woman, an isha almanah, to lakalkalek. This odd-looking verb is an infinitive construct with a lamed prefix and the second-person singular object suffix on the end. The verbal pattern is what grammarians would call a pill pail. In this case, a pill pail infinitive construct. Now, if you've never heard of the pill pail, it's easiest to think of it as an alternative form of the PL. There are a number of these minor pattern variations, especially in the second theme, which consists of the PL, Pual, and Hithpael. These show up with certain weak verb types, mostly hollow verbs and geminate verbs. These appear in hollow verbs because there is no middle root letter to double. And they occur with geminate verbs because the second and third root letters are the same. In other words, they're more or less already doubled. So here we have the hollow root, kaf, wow, lamed, cool. And in the pill pail, both of the root letters, the kaf and the lamed, are doubled. 23 of the 37 occurrences of this verb are in the pill pail pattern. The verb generally has the sense of to provide for, or perhaps to sustain or support. Here, provide for works pretty well. Verse 10 follows God's instruction with a description of what happens when Elijah does what God commanded him. This is all pretty straightforward grammatically. Vayakam, vayelik, Zarephath, and he arose and went to Zarephath. Vayavo el petach ha'ir, given the particle hine that begins the next clause, I think I would treat this clause as a circumstantial clause. That is, a clause that establishes the circumstance or situation of the action that follows. In this case, it sets the scene. This happens in the gate of the city. And as we mentioned before, in smaller cities and towns and villages, the gate to the city is often the main public square. It's typically where the market is located and where most of the business and legal proceedings take place. Quite often, there's a well. In a small town, probably the only well, just inside or just outside the gate. The scene might have looked like this one. This is the well that stands just outside the city gate at Beersheba in Israel. So this is very much a public place. Also, with Hine following, there's a sense of the immediacy implied in this clause. There is no delay. This encounter happens as soon as Elijah arrives at his destination. So I would read this as a circumstantial clause with a temporal emphasis. Something like, when he came to the gate of the city, V'hinei sham isha almanah mikashosheth etim. The hine expresses the immediacy of the encounter, as we said. And if we were being colloquial, we might render this as something like, hey, there she was. So right away he sees her, and isha almanah, a widow woman, and she is makoshesheth etzim. The verb is a feminine singular polale participle from the root kof sheen sheen, kashash. The polale, like the pill pail that we encountered in the last verse, is one of those variations on the PL pattern. In this case, it's a formation that occurs with a geminate verb. The holum, or long O vowel, might be confusing here. It's possible that you would see that and think that this is a call participle. But look more closely. See the mame performative? I suppose at the time of Elijah, they might have said, Hine mame, behold the mame. Well, the presence of the mame tells you this cannot be call, so it has to be a polale. And by the way, a quick check of the lexicon would confirm not only that this is from kashash, meaning to collect or gather, but would inform us that all 6 of the occurrences of this verb are in the polale pattern. The woman is gathering etzim. This is the plural of the noun eitz that we typically render as wood. So here we're talking about pieces of wood, or perhaps we might say sticks, because this would be wood for domestic use, wood for a fire in a small oven, the kind that you would have in a home. And you wouldn't be putting large pieces of wood in an oven like that. We might wonder how to envision this scene. This is in the city gate, so there were probably not a lot of trees there. And in any case, most of the women in the city would need to get wood for their kitchen fire every day. So it may be there was some kind of communal wood pile that the men gathered and left there for distribution, or perhaps even a vendor supplying firewood to the townswomen. It's an interesting real world kind of question, but unfortunately, it's also the kind of question that we just can't answer either from the text or from archaeology. In this case, she was probably not hunting around to pick up little pieces of wood lying off the ground. She's probably going to some specific place to get it. One way or another, there she is, fetching wood. And so Elijah speaks to her. Vayikra elau. The text gives us what he says. Vayomer kikina li ma'at mayim bekali wa ishte. The form kiki is a call feminine singular imperative from the root lamed kof chet, lakach. We usually translate this take or receive. But here, Elijah is asking her to provide something for him, to fetch it and provide it. So maybe a word like get would be a better rendering in this context. The imperative is followed by the particle na. Sometimes this is called the particle of entreaty. The name seems a bit peculiar to me, but it does describe the function well enough. This particle has the force of softening the imperative from a command to a request. That's why in beginning Hebrew, students typically learn to translate this word as meaning please. The point here is that Elijah is asking, not ordering. And what he is asking for is ma'at mayim bakli. The noun ma'at is used to refer to a small amount of something. Here we'd be referring to a small amount of water. So we might render it something like a little water or even a drink of water. Bakli. This is the preposition beth on the noun kli. The noun kli is a sort of general purpose word. Sometimes it's very generic, maybe something like a thing, but often it refers to some kind of container or vessel. Presumably in this case, we're talking about a small clay cup or mug. It wouldn't be glass in the technical sense of glass as a material. While some early forms of glass certainly existed in the ancient Near East from well before 3000 BC, it was mostly either in the form of naturally occurring volcanic glass, what we call obsidian. They mostly used that for weapons or tools like knife blades or arrowheads. Or it was that fairly primitive colored glazed substance, most often a shade of greenish blue, that we call faience. That was often cast into beads or scarabs or small statues. We do have some examples of faience cups from Egypt from before this time period, but they're somewhat fragile, and it's pretty unlikely that a poor widow from Zarephath would have had one. So we should probably think of this kli as a small pottery cup or mug, most likely without any kind of handle. Finally, Elijah indicates the purpose for this little mug of water. Wa'eshte. This is a wow conjunctive, call imperfect, first person singular, from the root shin, tau, he, shata, so that I can drink. Like the previous verse, this is pretty straightforward prose as Elijah adds to his previous request. Vatelik akaketh. As before, given what follows, I think I would take this as a circumstantial clause and read, as she went to get. The form lakaketh might be just a bit confusing. The root is lamed kof kate, lakak, to take or receive, or perhaps more generally to get. The normal call infinitive construct is simply kaketh without the lamed. Here the lamed on the front of the form is not the root letter lamed. It's the preposition lamed that has been added to the front of the form, as it frequently is with infinitive constructs. Vayikra ela vayomer. Elijah called to her and said, Lekekina li patlekim biyadek. The first verb form is a feminine singular call imperative from the same lakach that we just saw. In the previous verse, this feminine imperative form occurred as kiki instead of the likki we have here. You might wonder why that is. If you consult the lexicon, you would find that both forms occur. So I decided to take it a little further. I searched for all the call feminine singular imperatives of this root using Logos Bible software and found that of the 5 instances of the feminine, 4 of them are the shorter form. And of the masculine singular imperatives, there's 1 longer form out of 92 instances. In other words, yes, the longer forms do occur, but they're pretty rare. And we have to allow the possibility that they might represent errors in copying. Either way, it doesn't change the meaning in any way. So Elijah asks her, "Get for me a patlekim b'yadech, a piece of bread in your hand." The noun pat, like the previous word ma'at, refers to a small portion of something. Almost all of its 14 instances are clear references to bread, and those that are not clear references to bread may still be references to bread as well, given the context. So it may be that this word was used specifically to refer to pieces of bread. Or the usage pattern that we see may just reflect the fact that bread was one of the most important components of the diet of people in the biblical world. Certainly it was more central to their diet than it is for most people in the Western world of our day. For them, bread was a life-sustaining food, and that's important to what happens next. Verse 12 gives us the widow woman's response. Unfortunately for us, she begins by making an oath. Vatomer Yahweh Elohecha. Then she said, "By the life of Yahweh your God." The reason I said this is unfortunate for us is that she swears an oath, and that oath formulas are among the most troublesome syntactical structures in biblical Hebrew for most beginning readers. So let's spend a minute looking at oath formulas in general. I'm just going to cover the basics, not all the variations. So we'll call this a brief introduction to the oath formula. What we call the oath formula is used for both oaths and curses, and the two are basically the same in structure, though the first clause will differ just a bit. The formula is made up of 2 parts. The first part is the Protasis. This contains the thing being sworn by, or the consequences of the curse, if the oath is not fulfilled. And it usually comes first in the formula. In a curse, the Protasis is expressed in English using the optative. It would be something like, "May the Lord do this and more to me." In an oath, the Protasis is typically an exclamation like, "As I live," or in the case of our text, "As Yahweh your God lives." In the Protasis, the oath taker is swearing by something that he or she holds dear. This underscores the seriousness of the assertion that will follow. The second part of the formula is called the apodosis. This contains the circumstance or the statement that is being asserted by the speaker. The apodosis, usually the second clause, gives us the substantial claim that the oath maker is asserting. It's typically introduced in one of 2 ways. The first uses the particle "im." The normal translation for "im" is with the English "if." In the oath formula, the Hebrew "im" is used to assert things that the speaker says will not happen. So let's take a look at an example. If I wanted to take an oath that I did not know someone, I might say in Hebrew, Chai ani im yadatihu. We might render this literally as, by my life, if I know him. What I mean by that is that my life will be forfeit if I know him. So in effect, I'm saying, I swear by my life that I do not know him. Notice that the sense of what the speaker means ends up as a negative statement, even though the sentence itself is grammatically positive. This is what makes oath formulas a little tricky. They're quite often best expressed in English by the opposite of what they appear at first glance to say. So if I wanted to turn that last sentence around and swear that I did not know him, I might say, Chai ani imlo yadatihu. By my life, if I do not know him. Or effectively, I swear by my life that I do know him. The second way that the apodosis is introduced is using the particle ki. This is the emphatic use of ki. By using ki, the speaker is effectively doubling down on his assertion of what will happen or what the circumstance is. To stick with the example that I used before, I could swear that I know the person by saying, Chai ani ki yadatihu. Literally, by my life, surely I know him. And as before, we could express this in English either positively or negatively. We could say, I swear by my life that surely I know him. Or we could say, may my life be forfeit if I do not know him. Let's look at our text again. It begins, by the life of Yahweh your God. That's the protasis. Now here comes the apodosis, and this one's a little bit extra tricky because it's a compound, meaning she's making two claims. The first is, im yesh li ma'od. If we were trying to render this as literally as possible, we might say, by the life of Yahweh your God, if I have a ma'og. Now, this is the only occurrence of this word ma'og in the Tanakh. It appears to be related to the verb ayin waw gimel, ug, meaning something like to draw a circle or to make a circle. The noun ma'og would then refer to something that's circular. In this context, we're undoubtedly talking about a disc, a round loaf of bread. Remember, in the biblical world, most bread came in round loaves, not in rectangular ones. Some posit a meaning of bake related to this same verbal root, but that's probably a secondary development, deriving from the idea of making a circular loaf of bread. So I think we could just read this as the word loaf. The widow woman swears, by the life of Yahweh your God, if I have a loaf, meaning, of course, that she does not have one. So to make this good English, we might render it something like, as Yahweh your God lives, I swear that I do not have a loaf of bread. In the next clause, she's going to tell us what she does have. The second assertion that the widow makes is introduced by the compound ki'im. Now, this is typically adversative and is used here to indicate what she does have instead of a loaf of bread. So she's saying, in effect, I swear by the life of Yahweh your God that I have nothing except, and we could express that simply in English, either by using the word except or the adversative phrase, but only. Ki'im melo kaf kema bakav, but only a melo. This is a common noun related to the verb maim lamed aleph, malay, which means to be full in the call or to fill up something in the peel. The noun is used for an amount that fills something. Here it's connected to the word for hand or palm. And so the combination would be something like our word handful. The noun kemah refers to flour or meal in the sense of the stuff that is ground from grain and used for baking bread. So all she has is a handful of flour in a cath. This is a jar or vessel, the kind of small container that would be used for storage and that a person might carry around. Uma'ashimin b'tzakath, and a little bit of oil in the tzakath. This noun occurs about 7 times in the Tanakh and is used for a small jar or a jug. Wahinani makoshesheth shanayim etzim. Here the particle hine is used to focus the attention of the reader on the action represented by the participle that follows. The verb kof shin, kashash, is used a handful of times to refer to collecting or gathering something. In this case, she's gathering shanayim etzim. The noun eitz is used for wood, or in this case, little pieces of wood, what we might call sticks. And the small amount is emphasized by the use of shanayim, literally 2, but here being used something like we would use the words a couple of, refer to a few of something, not necessarily literally 2, but a couple of pieces of wood. So we'd probably read this phrase as, so here I am gathering a few pieces of wood. Ubati, wa isithi li, walivni, wa akal nuhu, wa matnu, so that I can go and make it. The it is in the form of the suffix on the verb, wa asithihu, for me and for my son, so that we can eat and die. So after 3 years of drought and the famine that goes along with it, this poor widow woman has lost all hope for the future. And in her despair, she's getting ready to prepare to eat her last meal. But into her despair comes the prophet of Yahweh, the very man who had delivered God's message that this famine would occur. And he speaks to her the most insanely outrageous thing that anyone could imagine. Vayomer Eleha Eliyahu. Then Elijah said to her, Al Kiri. The particle al with the imperfect creates a negative command with immediate force. In this context, it may imply that the woman was already afraid. And so I think I would read it as stop being afraid. Vo'i asi kidbarek. Here we have 2 feminine singular imperatives, go and do, followed by a noun with the comparative preposition kaf on the front and a second person suffix on the end. According to your word. Most English translations render this a little more loosely as if it were a verb with something like, as you have said. And that's fine insofar as it captures the point of what's being said here. But the remarkable thing is what he tells her next. Ak asili misham uga kitana Barashana Wahotsethi li. The Hebrew ak is an adverb. It's used in two ways. First, it's frequently used as an emphatic or asseverative term. In that case, we would read it as surely or certainly. But here, it may be used in its more common way to introduce an exception to what was just said. And I think that's really the use that we have here. So we would read it as however or except. So we read except, make from there, meaning from what you have there, and uga katana, a small uga. The word is related, at least in terms of its verbal root. It comes from the same root as that word ma'og that we had just a moment ago. So it refers to a small rounded loaf or a serving of bread, perhaps the ancient equivalent of a modern dinner roll. It's really hard to know what English word to use for this. Roll might be the right idea, but it doesn't seem to fit easily into the sentence when we say it. A slice would suggest about the right amount, but a slice is too anachronistic for ancient Israel. So maybe loaf would work best. So the prophet outrageously says to this desperate woman, go and do as you said, except first, Berishonah, make for me from what you have there a small loaf, and Hotziet li, bring it to me. The verb is a hiphil from yatzah. Walak walivnek ta'asi ba'akaronah. Then, for yourself and for your son, you can make ba'akaronah, afterward. What it is that she can make afterward is omitted, but it's clear from the context that he's saying that she can make something, referring to another small loaf, for herself and her son. Imagine this poor woman, if you can. Imagine what she must have thought when this stranger tells her to take her very last bit of food in the world and give it to him. How utterly outrageous this demand is. If it had been me, I probably would have replied sarcastically, well, you left out that part about dying, didn't you? Yes, he did. But you see, he's not finished with her yet. So we turn to verse 14. Elijah's speech to the woman continues. Ki koamar Yahweh Elohei Yisrael. For thus has Yahweh, the God of Israel, spoken. Kath hakemah lo tikla, the vessel of flour. We had both of these verbs back in verse 12. Lo tikla, the verb kaf lamed hey, kala, generally has the idea of something being complete or finished. But there are a variety of ways that something can be regarded as complete or finished, depending on what it is. And since here we're talking about the food supply, the idea is that it will not run out or be exhausted. So we might read, the vessel of flour will not run out. Watzafacheth hashemish lo techsar, and the jar of oil will not techsar. The root chet samish resh, chasar, is used to talk about the shortage or lack or need of something. This is the word that is used in the very first verse of Psalm 23. Yahweh is my shepherd, I shall not want, or I shall not be in need. Here the idea is that the jar will not be needy. That's a way of saying it will not become empty and need to be refilled. Adom Tethan Yahweh Geshem al Pnei Ha'adamah, until the day of Yahweh's giving rain upon the face of the land. Here, the only difficulty is this odd looking form. What's going on here? Well, a quick look at the textual apparatus helps us out. The textual note, that's note 14b in the Masoretic text, reads, Taith, sic q, non MSS CF 619E. What all that means is that this form equals the form taith. Okay, taith is the infinitive construct of the verb natan, to give. But what's the odd pointing about? Next phrase of the textual note, seek q, gives us the answer. Seek is the Latin for thus or so, but what's the q? Well, q is the abbreviation used for the Aramaic word kere. You might recall having at some point heard of what we often call a Kethiv Kere reading. Without going into too much detail, a Kethiv Kere is an indication in the Masoretic text that the Masoretes believe that for some reason what is written in the consonantal text has to be read differently. Kethiv is Aramaic for what is written. Kere is Aramaic for what is read. To indicate this, the Masoretes leave the consonantal text intact. They don't change it. The consonants that are written stay written, but they point them with the vowels of the word that they want you to read. In manuscripts like Codex Leningrad, the consonants that go with the vowels to be read are printed out in the margins. In Logos Bible software, and you have the text expanded to show the variant forms, there are 3 forms given. The main text is what is actually written in the Codex Leningrad. Below that, you have the reconstructed form that the Kethiv represents. In this case, it would be titain, the call imperfect third feminine singular or second masculine singular form. And below that is the form that the Masoretes want you to actually read, what we call the kere. In this case, it is the form taith, the call infinitive construct. Now you can see the problem. The form in the text is either a third feminine singular imperfect or a second masculine singular imperfect, and neither of those makes any sense in the context. Hence, the Masoretes believe that the correct form is the infinitive construct. So they've pointed the word so that you'll read it as an infinitive construct. And to be frank, they're undoubtedly correct. The rest of the textual note adds a bit more information. The entry NONN MSS, non-MSS, means that there are some Hebrew manuscripts from the Middle Ages that preserve this reading, in this case, taith. And the last part, CF 619E, points you to another place, 1 Kings 6:19, where there is a different infinitive construct incorrectly written as an imperfect form. So while there was evidently a mistake in copying somewhere along the way, it's pretty easy to sort out what is or should be the correct reading. This ends Elijah's instructions. And in the next verse, we learn how the widow responds and what happens afterward. The last 2 verses are pretty straightforward. In verse 15, in which we read of the widow's response, there's really only one interesting grammatical feature. The verse begins, Watelek wata'aseh kedabar Eliyahu. Then she went and did according to the word of Elijah. Or as we might say in more contemporary English, she went and did as Elijah had said. Vatomer he wahu wabetha yamim. Here's that grammatical oddity that I mentioned. It is in this compound subject, he wahu ubetha, she and he and her house. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this since it doesn't really affect the meaning at all, but it's something that we need to be aware of. In the previous verse, we encountered a Kethiv Kare reading, in which the Masoretes pointed the text with the vowels of the word they want you to read instead of the vowels that normally go with the written consonants. Well, here we have another one. Notice that the consonants are for the masculine pronoun who, but they're pointed with a heric as if they were for the feminine pronoun he. And the reverse is true of the feminine pronoun that follows. It's pointed as if it were the masculine pronoun. Despite the written consonants, the Masoretes want you to read the sequence she and he and her household, instead of what the consonants suggest, which would be he and she and her household. There's not really a lot of difference here. Now, we can't be certain, but it appears that the reason for this is that the verb is feminine. And normally, when you have a compound subject like this one, the verb will match the gender of the first word in the sequence of subjects. And to get it that way, you have to read it the way that the Masoretes have them pointed rather than the way that they're written. She and he and her household ate yamim. This looks a bit odd, but it's really quite simple. This is just an example of the common practice in biblical Hebrew of placing a noun at the end of a clause to use that noun adverbially. So we read it as 4 days. By the way, the word yamim, when used by itself like this, sometimes has the sense of a year. I don't think that's the case here. It just doesn't seem to fit the context all that well. Most English translations end up adding the word many, reading for many days, and that certainly works well and it's grammatically appropriate. However, I tend to agree with those who understand the adverbial sense here more like the idea of every day. Verse 16 is a summarizing statement that ends the account. It repeats the same vocabulary that we've encountered throughout the passage, so we won't comment on those words again here. Kad hakemah lo kalatha. The jar of flour did not run out. Wa tapaketh hashimin lo chaser. And the vessel of oil did not become empty. Kedabar Yahweh asher deber bayad Eliyahu. According to the word of Yahweh, which had been spoken by the hand of Elijah. Now, here's one thing. Obviously, the use of yad, hand, is metaphorical here. This word yad is often used to indicate the agency of something, that is, the person by whom something is done. You know this, you've encountered the phrase, something was done by the hand of the Lord, meaning it was simply done by God. So here, the text simply means that it was spoken by Elijah, and not literally by his hand. In this account, we hear of the remarkable faith of a Canaanite widow. When Elijah, the prophet of Yahweh, a God that she did not even worship at that point, commanded her to trust her life and the life of her son to him, she obeyed. The narrative uses this account of her faith as a contrast to condemn the faithlessness of the Israelites who had abandoned Yahweh to worship the very god Baal, who proved unable to provide for this Canaanite woman. Centuries later, according to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus refers to this account in the same way, to contrast the faithfulness of the woman with the lack of faith of the people of his own day. And Matthew's Gospel records the account of Jesus going up to that same area and performing a miracle of healing for a Canaanite woman who exhibited more faith than the Israelites to whom he had been sent. To her, Jesus said, "O woman, great is your faith." The same might be said of Elijah's widow of Zarephath. She's the example of how God wants us to be. And her example condemns our lack of complete trust in God as surely as it condemned the lack of faith in the Israelites of Elijah's day. So, may God grant us a portion of faith as great as that of this Canaanite woman. I'm Dr. David Adams. Thank you for joining me to read through 1 Kings 17, verses 8 to 16. I hope you'll join me again soon to read through another portion of the Word of God in the original Hebrew text of the Tanakh. Until then, shalom in Jesus.